is for Poles on the Aryan side, not Jews.
On the authority of the Commissar's office, 23 prisoners were executed at 10 this morning.
These were innocent people.
You understand? I'm sick of it. Watching and waiting and standing by and being passive. I won't do it anymore.
The largest armies in the world have not been able to defeat the Nazis. What makes you think that a handful of untrained Jewish citizens with pistols will be the ones to prevail?
We can and we will fight our enemy now!
Well, the biggest difference between Uprising and almost every film made about the Holocaust is that in Uprising, the Jews resist. It's a story of active, armed resistance. And that was a story that I had never seen. And that's what interested me from the beginning, and that's what interests me today. And it led me to examine a very long period, about 7 years now, and when I started, the whole issue of resistance in general.
I'm a veteran of the Polish armed services.
Then you are a fighter, huh?
Sort of created a kind of interesting question to me, why it is that the Jews were labeled as passive, when other victims of genocide, perhaps not on the same level, were never so labeled. I don't think anybody's ever heard the Rwandans being described as passive, or the Cambodians who were murdered by the Khmer Rouge as being passive, or what happened in Bosnia, Serbia. I don't remember the word passive being attached to the victims. And I kept thinking, why was it that the Jews were considered passive? And when you take the example of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which was the largest single example of resistance on every level, and then you walk backwards, and as you get to know the people who were there, what you experience is that they all resisted. They resisted in the means and ways that they had at their disposal.
Take off your hat.
No, thank you.
I said take off your hat.
A lot of people also wondered, why didn't more Jewish people rebel? I know that's a really big question. How can they just go off so passively into this concentration camps? Why are they, why didn't they fight back?
There's an interesting anecdote that I heard about a couple thousand Russian army officers who were being marched to their death. And you know how many people were guarding them? 2 armed Germans. These are professional soldiers. How come they didn't attack them? Certainly they could have killed them. Maybe 40 people would die, 50 people, 10. Why didn't they do it? I think you're dealing with a very interesting psychological situation, and I think it's an unfair moniker that was slapped on the Jews, in a way, the final indignity of the Holocaust. And that was something that over time became sort of a driving force behind my desire to see this movie get made.
We now know that 300,000 Warsaw Jews have been either sent to Treblinka, a death camp, or have simply been murdered. For now, the deportations have ceased. They're going to resume. And when they do, we will no longer submit. We are going to respond with armed resistance.
My character, Mordecai Analevich, and a few other of his friends, founded this Jewish resistance, this underground movement to undermine deportations to the death camps and to basically pester and kill the Nazis in any way they could.
It was an idealistic organization with a socialist bent, in which it was a true collective. The emphasis was on the group, on the collective, and not on the individual.
Here, in case you run into trouble again, you and me, we're going to put a stop to this, yes?
What really, really moved me when I learned about the story was that these people fought for honor. And I felt that it was so devoid from most of our lives. I mean, recently with the tragedy at the World Trade Center, you saw people there behave with great honor and great valor, from the firefighters to the police and to ordinary citizens. And I think part of, what is coming out of the ashes there, if there's a phoenix rising out, it's a sense of sacrifice, and it's a sense of the recognition of honor on all levels, again, from the most mundane to the most obviously heroic. And that really moved me, that these kids essentially decided to fight knowing that they were going to die.
Once they organized and decided we're going to fight to the death, they never for a moment thought any of them would live. They thought we would at least go out with a bang.
Mordecai always said there's only one thing we can control in this terrible Nazi situation, and that's how we die. And so their deaths were all they had, and how to use it was all they had.
The spirit of our deaths. The spirit of our deaths will shape the soul of a new generation, the new nation of Jews.
They actually held them out of the ghetto for over a month, for actually quite a while. Some fought for a very long time.
What's incredible is that this young Jewish youth fought, German army, the Nazis, for longer than the entire Polish army did.
And if other Jews are emboldened by this turn of events, other sectors initiate their own uprisings, it spreads to the Poles, you see the implications, see the cause for concern.
I think there's an unwritten rule that we were following, which is don't try and dramatize the Holocaust. Just tell the story. If possible, let the story tell itself. The difficult thing was to find out where the real characters intersected and how a narrative could be taken out of these historical characters and these historical events. Paul Brickman had a very interesting interpretation of Adam Cherniakoff, who was the head of the Jewish Council, the Judenrat, which is sort of like being the mayor of New York, if you will. And his interpretation, which I agreed with, was that this man did everything in his power to mitigate the damages that were being inflicted upon his people by the Germans.
In his hopefulness, Cherniakoff tried to create a negotiating position where he could bargain to make the life a little easier until it was over.
His crucial mistake was that he thought the people he was bargaining with, exchanging pleasantries, were people, and they weren't.
Strip the women naked. This won't happen again.
For me, one of the things that was interesting, besides the fighters, was the character of Fritz Hippler, Dr. Fritz Hippler, who was a filmmaker who did The Eternal Jew, and who was, one of the pets of Goebbels. And because as I did this research, almost all of the photos that exist are actually German propaganda photos created by Hitler's people. Some of it was almost incredible to me. I felt like watching a Saturday Night Live skit that had gone slightly awry. But I thought by portraying it, it would be chilling.
I was assigned by Herr Goebbels to film this operation. He says the film of these engagements will outlast us all. Victory will outlast us all. This is not victory. All depends on where you put the camera.
And his debate, if you will, with General Stroop, is played by John Voight, especially Stroop himself. In his diary wrote, on May 16th, he blew up the Tlamotsky Street Temple and said, Warsaw's Judenrein, Warsaw is free of Jews, which in fact was not the case. The Jews were living underground and fought. The latest record I'm aware of is up to December. My interpretation is that Stroop lost, that if there were a battle, if you will, for the Warsaw Ghetto, the purpose was not only to eradicate it, but was to get rid of the leaders. And many of the leaders, as we all know, did escape and continued to fight. So that was sort of an interesting opportunity to interpret for me that I think will shed, a slightly new light on, or at least offer, an opportunity for discussion among the experts about what did or did not happen there.
Enough!
The problems that you have to create a movie are just, they're infinite. I had to accumulate enough knowledge to, one, be able to ask these people questions that would not be insulting and be able to listen. And then after all the information that I got, I had to pass that on to so many different people that you use to make a movie. And I met survivors in New York, Los Angeles, Poland, Israel, all over. Just scores and scores of them. And I became quite knowledgeable. Kajik was enormously helpful. His influence was details, factual things.
I see little kids running and people starving and feathers floating through the air, and I say, wow, this looks incredible, this looks so real, and there's all these buildings. And all of a sudden you look over and you see this man, he's standing there and he's laughing or smiling or staring, and you realize, wow, he was here.
He looked around for maybe 45 seconds and he pointed to a third floor in the square and he said, that was my apartment. And I think we all sort of had chills down our spine.
I thought that
for a second or for a minute that I am back in the Warsaw Ghetto. It was something unbelievable. Really. It was shocking.
And action! To create these bodies, these actors, these characters, was an enormous challenge as a filmmaker. I mean, much of the cast wasn't Jewish, so they didn't even begin with, whatever it is that being a Jew is, just as being black is or being Spanish is. And I've always believed actors can play anything, whether it's PC or not, to have that feeling. That's what I felt.
John Avnet was very persistent. I said, one, I'm not Jewish. When I was in university, I wished that I was either Irish or Jewish. But I so regretted my wretched blue eyes. And he talked with me and convinced me that I could play that character and that I was Jewish.
I'd say, okay, let's do this scene. And they had to be ready. They had to be prepared. They had to have their ideas. So they wanted to say something, they'd say, no, or let's try that, or let's do this. And it was a very loose and somewhat improvisy feeling. All I had to do that was start them in a position and say, go, because we had done the improvs, and they were able to get that kind of movement that just feels real. And that was so important to me because I knew from early on, much earlier than I ever had making a movie, that I was going to shoot this in a quasi-documentary style. And it was a little frustrating to my ADs because they like to rehearse things, and I wouldn't rehearse it. I wouldn't rehearse it for the camera department. I'd say, you got to hit this. You're out of focus, get in focus. And Denis Lenoir, my French cinematographer, did a fantastic job. Part of why this story probably hadn't been told was because physically it was so difficult. Raffaele De Laurentiis is the production brilliance genius, if you will, that put all the people together and made this happen.
It wasn't a set. They built the ghetto. They built acres of buildings and cobblestone streets. And they looked like they'd been there for centuries.
It had to be designed, the technical drawings. And was it feasible? And I had come up with the idea of not building in this flat area that Raphael wanted. I want to build it right in the middle of Bratislava.
Well, it was entirely created for the movie because the ghetto actually was not this layout. We took like 1.5 months to draw the proper building drawings, and took 3 months to build and paint and set dressing.
It was just an extraordinary set. It was living, it was vital. When you saw children marching out of there.
They have no idea even really that they're making a film. And that innocence of them being oblivious to even what they're doing and where they're being led was the innocence and the naivete of the children being led happily, almost, to their death.
Dr. Koshak, why are you here? You're exempt from the order. What about the children? Children must support Comprei. Then I will do as well.
Action!
As you can see, there's nothing to indicate that it isn't 1939 in here, including the way I'm dressed.
When you're doing a period film, I think costumes. I mean, it's what tends to give you your period, along with, again, with production design and set dressing. I think they're very important, but at the same time, we want them to look real and not like costumes. So that's sometimes harder to accomplish than anything.
Every cobblestone that you see on the set, which we built 300 meters long, 4 stories high, was laid by hand. There aren't a lot of cobblestones in most places. Now, how important is that? I don't know. For me, it's important. Remember, we were working on a ridiculously tight budget, and we had 73 or 74 days to shoot the film.
I came around a corner and I saw hundreds of people in wardrobe and, horses and dogs, and I was just completely overwhelmed. I mean, the whole set came to life. It's incredible.
To figure out how to do the signage and what the buildings look like. And then they had to be practical enough that we could put fighters on the roofs and in the windows. And I also wanted designed tie-ins where you could be in Mordecai's job look at and see the Germans marching in.
I mean, the way that they built this set is amazing. It's absolutely amazing.
Some stunt guy's getting lit on fire. The camera's on him, goes to Rada, goes to the kids, goes back to Rada, goes to him, goes to Hank. They're all firing and everything's going at once, and that's one piece. There are 4 other things going on at the same time. I mean, It's insane. But you want to be pretty tight, all right? Yeah, lose that one. Get that camera over there, also tight, you know, like on 100 on a flamethrower over here. I was having some vodka with Kajik and Marek, and Kajik turned to me and said, "Do you think the Holocaust could happen again?" And I said, my typical hopeful way, "I hope not." And he said to me, he thought it could.
Maybe having seen a film or documentary about it, nothing can compare to being present at it, and it's just overwhelming to know that this actually happened.
Mordecai was a teacher, and he was interested in philosophy and history, and he asked a question very early on: how can a moral man maintain his moral code in an immoral world? Which is a very relevant question in the middle of occupied Poland, in the middle of the Jewish ghetto especially. What do you do?
What this film has to try to overcome, to show, is it is impossible to describe in a human language an inhuman situation. Impossible.
I'm not going to give up my hope, but I feel, unfortunately, that the question about how you live morally in an immoral world is unfortunately more present than I ever anticipated it to be.
To remind people to remember what they have not experienced, to force them to remember. And in that sense, John Abnett's picture is running parallel to that, to force you to remember man's inhumanity to man.
In rehearsal, when I saw the level of commitment, when I saw the emotional connection of the actors to the material, to their characters, and to one another, I realized, and everybody else realized there, that we had something that was really just special. No matter what we did, we'd probably never have that experience or anything close to it in our lives again. Confidence is something that's not something you carry with you. It's something that you think you ought to have. And then when you get into rehearsal, you think, huh? And when I did go into rehearsal, that's when I knew I had a chance for a great movie, because that's what I cared to do. I mean, in the simplest terms, my goal was to be a messenger for millions of people who had no voices.